Hi guys, my name is Manav Kapoor. I'm currently teaching at the Nalsad University of Law, Hyderabad, where I'm taking courses on public international law and comparative constitutional law. In today's module, I'll be discussing the idea of constitutionalism in the global south and how this has worked over the last 20 years. In the course of this presentation, we will be examining a few things. We'll be examining the way in which constitutions have developed in the global south. The three main axes of discussion will be dealing with the idea of transformative constitutions, socio-economic rights in these constitutions, and how these constitutions have dealt with colonial legacies. Now, in order to understand this, we might need to understand a little bit about what the comparative constitutional law project has been all about over the last few years. Now, the 20th century, with some justification, has been called the age of constitutionalism. Now, why is this? Let us just go back 100 years. In 1914, there were about 40 to 50 sovereign states, many of which had unwritten constitutions. In today's date, we have at least 212 sovereign countries. Most of them have their own written constitutions. Many of them also have a Bill of Rights within them and other provisions. Now, the 20th century has been called, with some justification, the age of constitutionalism. Why is this? Now, let's go back 100 years. In 1914, about 100 years ago, we had about 40 to 50 sovereign states, most of which had constitutions, but the constitutions there were very unlike the constitutions that as we know them. Very few of them had a Bill of Rights in place. In today's date, we have about 212 sovereign countries, most of which have written constitutions, many of which have a Bill of Rights within them. So constitutionalization, as we know it, has not happened in a sequence, but has happened in what many comparative constitutional law scholars have referred to as a set of waves. Now, what does this mean? This means that there have been points of time where a large number of new constitutions have come up. The first such phase after the middle of the 20th century was in the middle of the 1940s. The end of the Second World War also saw a set of countries gaining independence from colonial rulers. For example, and therefore a new set of constitutions emerging. One set of these constitutions were those imposed upon Germany and Japan by victors, which are also called victor constitutions, usually imposed by, among others, the US and the UK. On the other hand, the first wave of decolonization that came up as a result of the Second World War saw countries like India gaining independence. The Indian and the Filipino constitution as such were constitutions that came up as a direct result of the decolonization process. This process continued throughout the 1950s and 1960s, which is when we see the second phase from the end of the 1950s to the 1970s, where a large number of constitutions were promulgated in former colonial territories in Asia and Africa. Post the 1990s, we see the third wave of constitutionalization. Post the 1990s, we see the third wave of constitutionalization and constitutionalism, where we see two events happening. The first is the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War saw many new constitutions being drawn up in what were formerly Soviet and communist countries. The second event, not related directly to the end of the Cold War, but nevertheless very significant for our topic today, was the end of apartheid in South Africa and the creation of the South African Constitution. Now, we will discuss this in greater detail throughout the course of our discussions today. Now, what has happened is that this has significantly broadened the scope of comparative constitutional law. However, in what continues to happen is that most comparative constitutional law scholarship has not suitably analyzed or responded to these new developments. Rather, most authors continue to focus on only a certain set of countries. The vast majority of the countries that are focused on are developed countries. There are, however, a few exceptions. India, for example, and South Africa are notable exceptions to the rule of the West being fundamental in comparative constitutional law. Now, there has therefore been. Now, let's first understand what we mean by the global South. Now, the global South, we must understand, does not mean the South in a geographical sense as such. These countries are what were earlier called developing countries or third world countries. Most countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America come within this ambit. Now, given the large number of countries, in fact, a vast majority of the countries in the world come within the ambit of the global south, it's a little difficult to make generalizations about what the global south is all about. Nevertheless, one can see certain commonalities that help in understanding comparative constitutional law trends in these areas. The first is colonization. Most of these countries have been colonized either formally or informally at some point of time in their histories. As a result, many comparative law scholars have felt that these constitutions were merely copies of those of their colonial masters and have not given these the importance they deserve. Increasingly, however, this is being found to be a false trend. What has happened also is that countries that originally had constitutions that were imposed upon them by their colonial masters have often have now changed their constitutions and have come up with new constitutions. Those who haven't changed the constitution have nevertheless shifted the interpretation in many ways. We will discuss some of them through the course of this presentation. Other similarities that the global south has is that many of these countries also grapple with issues of pervasive inequality. This inequality is of many kinds. It is economic, it is social, it is in some cases racial, and another point of similarity is that these countries are currently at various stages in the process of industrialization. Many of these, though by no means all, are also democracies. Therefore, the concerns of these countries are very distinct from those of what is now called the global north or the developed world. It is perhaps interesting then to see what the major axes of constitutional trends in these areas have been. Now, let's understand first what we mean by the term constitution. A constitution is, as we all know, of course, the fundamental legal text of a country. However, a constitution is also a lot more. Let us look at the etymology or how this word came about. Now, the word constitution is related to the word constitute or to create. Therefore, one can say that a constitution is also a means by which a polity is created or produced. For example, when we see the Indian preamble, the preamble of the Indian Constitution, we see the term "we the people of India." When we look at the US talks about "we the people of the US." Now, over here, this seems to suggest that the citizens of the country have a role to play in framing the Constitution, and the Constitution has a role to play in terms of creating a specific national identity. Now, it is a given that due to the experiences of these countries with poverty, colonialism, nationalism, often cases of corruption and totalitarianism, the concerns of these constitutions are going to be very different from those of the West. Now, these often attempt to transform the societies where they are situated in. Now, because of this, they are also more concerned, though of course not exclusively so, with socio-economic rights and with deeply fragmented societies divided on various axes. Now, we shall continue to describe this in greater detail. So, let's first look at the idea of transformative constitutions. Let's look at what they are and how they work. Now, if we were to effect a distinction between constitutions on the basis of how they function, one way of making such a distinction is through the idea of preservative versus transformative constitutions. A preservative constitution is a constitution that seeks to preserve a set of values and the social order of a particular state. A transformative constitution, on the other hand, attempts to use the law to challenge the way in which a state's legal, social and political structure works. Now, particularly when dealing with social and economic change. Karl Clare, a South African scholar, has talked about this. He says in his definition of what transformative constitutionalism is, that transformative constitutionalism is a long-term process of constitutional enactment, interpretation and institutions and note this. So, it is not only enactment, it is also the interpretation and enforcement committed to transforming the social and political institutions in a democratic, participatory and egalitarian direction, therefore facilitating change in non-violent ways. Now, let's look at examples of constitutions that are transformative. The first example is that of the South African Constitution. Why does the Global South require transformative constitutions? Let's recall the kind of problems we talked about in the Global South. There are systemic levels of inequalities on various axes. There is caste in South Asia, there's apartheid in South Africa, racism in Latin America, gender discrimination throughout much of these jurisdictions. Now, this requires a certain re engineering of society through the project of constitutionalism. Now, the South African constitution is one that has been often called, with good reason, transformative by birth. Now, let's see why this happened. The transformative nature of the South African constitution owes itself to the creation of the South African constitution after apartheid through a long drawn out and participatory process. The first case that the South African constitution dealt with, which deals with death penalty in a country that had emerged from decades of apartheid, by creating a constitution that consciously set out to protect human rights and the rights of people. Now, in the case of State versus Makwanyane, the South African Constitutional Court said that there is a stark and dramatic difference between the past in which South Africa was trapped and the future in which it now emerges. Needless to say, the South African court envisaged the constitution as a bridge between the deeply divided past and the no doubt glorious future it predicted for the republic. As a result of this, there are certain provisions in the South African constitution that were extremely liberal for its time and continue to be so 20 years down the line. The South African constitution, for example, has broad non-discrimination clauses in addition to a proscription of discrimination on the grounds of sex and race. There is also a clause that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. There are a set of socio-economic rights that have been enunciated in the constitution, and there is also an attempt that has been made to link the current South African constitution that emerges in a post-colonial setup with pre-colonial ideas of Ubuntu, for example. Ubuntu is an idea that emphasizes on how human rights can only be recognized by situating persons in the wider community of which she is a part. This does not mean that human rights are reduced in any way or are given less significance. Nevertheless, attempts are made to ensure that human rights result in the progress of everyone to their fundamental capacity. We will discuss this in greater detail in the third part of this module's presentation. The Indian constitution is a related example, but a slightly different one. In many ways, many commentators have said that the drafting of India's constitution itself was a revolutionary exercise and undoubtedly was unparalleled in India's legal history. However, the first case is interesting. The first case of the South African constitution, as we have just talked about, was the case of State versus Makwanyane, where an effective distinction is made between the divided past and the glorious present. The first case that the Indian Supreme Court dealt with was the case of A.K. Gopalan. Now, in the A.K. Gopalan case, the Indian Supreme Court upheld a pre-constitutional law that had allowed for preventive detention. Therefore, it is the opinion of many commentators that India's independence did not necessarily imply a break with the exclusionary structures that had prevailed before India's independence. However, when one talks about the Indian constitution as being a transformative constitution, one talks about how it has become transformative over the period of time. Now, over the course of the constitution's history, the interpretation of the constitution has substantially changed. Recall for a minute how Karl Clare's understanding of transformative constitutionalism focused not only on the text of the constitution, but also on the way in which it is interpreted. Now, let us look at the Indian example here. Now, post the 1970s, the constitution started, as we will discuss later, to read the right to life in a broader way. The right to life then moved from being merely a negative right that disallowed the state from interfering with life and personal liberty, except when laws allowed for such a situation, to a situation when the right to life started to be interpreted in a positive way. We will discuss this in the course of the second part of this presentation, when we talk about socio-economic rights. The other way in which the constitution has become transformative is in the way in which a large number of cases have started coming to the Supreme Court. Now, how has this happened? This has happened not only through the idea of specially petitions, but also through liberalized locus standi rules. In particular, through public interest litigation, there is now a means by which citizens can write a letter to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has the power to take suo motu action. A third way in which the Supreme Court can be a third way in which the Indian Supreme Court can be considered to be transformative is in the way in which it has fashioned its remedies. The way in which the Indian Supreme Court formulates its remedies is also a third way in which one can consider the Indian Supreme Court to be transformatory or transformative. Let's look at the case of PUCL versus Union of India, also known as the right to food case. Now, in this case, the court has very deliberately refrained from giving a judgment, but has decided to monitor the right to food in India through the course of various interim orders. This is a fascinating means by which the Supreme Court is assuming a supervisory role while allowing the government to carry out its own functions. The next set of countries we will look at is Latin America. Now, in Latin America, transformative constitution has worked not only in the ways in which it has worked in India and South Africa, but also in terms of particular situations that were unique to Latin America. In Latin America, for example, the rights of indigenous persons and gender parity had not been recognized, not only during the colonial era that had ended in the early 1820s and 30s, but also after that until very recently. Now, therefore, provisions of constitutions in Latin America have special and separate rights for indigenous people. Article 246 of the Colombian Constitution is a case in point. Article 57 of Ecuador's constitution is also fascinating. Now, this gives the right of collective territory, autonomy, and indigenous justice systems for indigenous people, in addition to recognizing a very fascinating right, the right to the use of nature. Now, what is significant in terms of a transformative constitution is, again, let's go back to Karl Klare. Let's see what he says. He again says that what is important is not only the text of the constitution, but also the spirit in which the constitution is interpreted. The Ethiopian constitution is a constitution that initially was meant to be transformative and had a number of innovative provisions. Now, lack of implementation and corruption in the country has meant that the constitution has not worked in the way it should have. This is a stark reminder of how important political support is to the project of transformative constitutions. The next thing that we're going to talk about after discussing transformative constitutions is look at another major thing that most of these constitutions have. This is the idea of socio-economic rights. Now, what are socio-economic rights? Socio-economic rights are understood as rights that give holders access to the substance of a minimally decent life, what the Indian Supreme Court calls a right to life with dignity and not mere animal existence. Now, these include rights such as the right to food, the right to clean air, the right to water, the right to social security, the right to health, work, and education. Now, it's interesting to look at the history of these rights. Now, initially, these rights were considered to be positive rights. What does a positive right mean? A positive right would be understood as a right that imposes positive obligations upon the state. This is usually looked at in distinction to the idea of negative rights. A negative right is something that the state only has to not do to ensure that the person has the substance of the right. In a positive obligation, however, the state has to do things to facilitate the creation of the right. Now, while socio-economic rights were earlier understood to be positive rights, many authors have criticized this. What they have said is that all rights, not only socio-economic rights, have both positive and negative connotations and components. Now, when we talk about socio-economic rights in the context of the global south, we are not saying that the global north does not recognize this or does not consider this as important. Many jurisdictions, even in the north, consider these to be very important. Some of the major countries in the north, however, for example, the US, do not, however, view this as rights in these jurisdictions, but they look at this as something that should be secured through the political rather than the legal process. through political negotiation and compromise. In many of the countries of the global south, however, this argument does not work. Let's compare two provisions, one from the way in which the Constitution of the US was understood, and in the way the South African Constitution was drafted. Now, when Thomas Jefferson, one of the drafters of the US Constitution, was drafting it at the end of the 18th century, he believed that the poor had no right to be free from want or free from poverty. The framers then saw the purpose of the government as being to police and safeguard its citizens, not to feed, clothe, and house. The South African Constitution, on the other hand, provides for a different conception of citizenship. It looks, for example, at what can be understood as a right to adequate housing in section 26 of the Constitution. Now, the right to adequate housing says that the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures to secure this right. Therefore, there are both positive and negative components to this. There is a right to provide adequate housing, and there is also a duty upon the state to not take away housing from, and there is also a duty upon the state to not take away housing from citizens. Let's look at the broad ways in which these rights have been secured in many of these jurisdictions and how successful these models have been. The first model through which socio-economic rights were sought to be secured in the global south was through the idea of directive principles. The Indian Constitution was one of the first countries to recognize the idea of directive principles in the global south, though they borrowed this from Ireland, where directive principles were understood in a somewhat different way. Now, the Indian Constitution considered these provisions to be non-justiciable, but nevertheless fundamental in the governance of the country. So these socio-economic principles were distinct from fundamental rights, which were considered to be, these directive principles were distinct from fundamental rights, which were considered justiciable. Directive principles, as we have discussed, were fundamental to the governance of the country in many ways, and were recognized as such in the Constitution. However, again, there was a belief that these would be secured through the political process. This model was adopted by other countries in Africa, such as Ghana and Nigeria. The Bangladeshi Constitution also has a set of directive principles. Though initially directive principles were recognized as non-justiciable, since the 1970s, however, the Indian Supreme Court has started recognizing them within the ambit of Article 21 of the Constitution. Article 21, as we have already discussed, was initially understood as a negative right. It basically said that no person could be deprived of his or her right to life or personal liberty. It basically said that no person could be deprived of his or her right to life or personal liberty except under procedure established by law. This right to life, however, has been broadened over the last few years, and many of the directive principles that aimed at ensuring socio-economic progress have now been read as part of Article 21. A right to education, for example, which is now embodied in Article 21A of the Constitution, owes its beginning to a directive principle that was read into Article 21. The right to food, the right to livelihood, and the right to shelter have all emerged in Indian laws through a broad reading of directive principles within the ambit of the right to life. Now, the major drawback of this, however, is this model is that this has not been adopted internationally. For example, most of the other countries that have adopted the idea of directive principles have not incorporated directive principles into any fundamental rights or equivalent thereof. The alternative to this has been something that South Africa and Kenya have followed over the last 20 years. This is the direct constitutionalization of these rights. Therefore, countries like South Africa, in drafting their constitutions, have not effected a distinction between civil, political, and socio-economic rights, and have basically said that the DPSP model would not be used in these countries. Even though the South African Constitution allows for leeway to be given to the state in terms of granting them the freedom to decide what their available resources are, it nevertheless considers them to be rights similar to any of the civil political provisions and continues to exercise a supervisory role upon them. Now, In doing so, the advantage is this, that it strengthens the positive obligation upon the state to provide, while simultaneously underscoring the negative obligation of the state not to deprive. Uh, this then leads to two different approaches that can be used in determining what the content of these rights are. Now, in contrast to the way in which civil political rights are normally viewed, socio-economic rights are distinguished by their greater requirement for a value, as in one is supposed to see how much of this right is to be secured and through what means. Now, two approaches have been postulated for this. Initially, the first idea was that of a minimum core approach. The minimum core approach says that a basic level of entitlement would take precedence over the broader enjoyment of the right. Therefore, all that was important in such rights was to render justiciable a basic minimum level. Now, this was supplanted by the idea of a reasonableness standard. The reasonableness standard argues that the minimum core level should not take into account the minimum core level does not take into account the actual capacity of the state, and therefore only makes a core of the right rather than the entire right justiciable. The South African Constitutional Court, however, has veered towards the reasonableness standard and has consistently rejected the minimum core approach in favor of the reasonableness standard. The reasonableness standard, however, has also been subject to limitations. The two cases that we are going to discuss are a good example of this. The first case that we are going to talk about is the Subramani case. Now, in the Subramani case, the South African Constitutional Court had to examine whether the patient suffering from kidney failure could have indefinite free access to dialysis. The patient argued that he was unable to afford dialysis and that the right to health embodied in the South African Constitution required him to be treated freely to dialysis for an indefinite period of time. Now, the court rejected the minimum core approach in this and set up a reasonableness standard. However, while setting up the reasonableness standard, it nevertheless said that the state did not have the wherewithal to provide free dialysis to all such patients. Therefore, while the court expressed sympathy for the patient, it stopped short of recommending free dialysis. The Grootboom case was a case where the right to housing was dealt with through the ambit of reasonableness. Now, the court examined various aspects of the right to housing that was given in section 26 of the South African Constitution and had both positive and negative consequences. Here, persons had put up temporary shacks on public land and were consequently evicted. They challenged this eviction in the South African Constitutional Court. The court, in examining their petition, held that there were a set of various interrelated rights that had accrued under section 26 of the Constitution dealing with the right to housing, with both positive and negative consequences, and therefore it was not reasonable for the state to evict persons when winter was coming without giving them any accommodation. Now, let's see how the court acts over here. Now, over here we see that the court acts as a supervisory body to see that the state is not violating its obligations. Justice Cato Regan of the South African Constitutional Court has, in a case dealing with the right to water called Mazibuko, argued that in doing so the court is widening the democratic process through what it calls participatory democracy. Very quickly we'll also see what critics have called problems with the idea of unrestricted socio-economic rights in Latin American jurisprudence. Now, in Latin American constitutions, the idea of human dignity and the creation of a just society have been given a great deal of importance. Writ petitions such as the tutelo and amparo are ways in which socio-economic rights have been guaranteed. The Brazilian constitution provides for a right to health and says that health, a right for all, is a duty for the state and shall be guaranteed through policies aimed at reducing the risk of illness and other hazards. The way in which this has worked is interesting. Now, this does not only mean the provision of inexpensive drugs, but also has been interpreted to include cancer medication, prosthetic limbs, and occasionally cell transplantation therapy, which is a very expensive procedure. Critics have argued that treating the right to health as an absolute right has two problems. One, it puts great pressure on the state's fiscal resources, and secondly, does not privilege the rights of the most disadvantaged, which is a major reason for the idea of socio-economic rights. Be as it may, however, socio-economic rights have, in the view of most commentators, have had a very beneficial role in the way in which societies have developed. The third aspect that we will briefly touch upon is the idea of these constitutions as post-colonial constitutions. Now, what we must understand was that in many cases, political independence was not always followed with the creation of uniquely national constitutions. Colonialism no doubt had a traumatic effect on indigenous societies, but independence was not always followed with social transformation. The British, for example, had often used the idea of what is called Lancaster House constitutions after the colonial office in London, where countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Zimbabwe had their first constitutions tailor-made for them by the British. The break from the past then that the constitution was supposed to represent often happened, if it did, much after independence. Now, usually it has taken a significant political, civil, and economic upheaval to create a truly post-colonial constitution which links to the past as well as the future. South Africa is an example we've already talked about. The idea of Ubuntu, as we have discussed earlier, is significant. Now, Bolivia is an interesting example of this. Bolivia got its independence in the 1820s or 30s, but its truly transformative constitution with links to the past and the future has emerged only 2 centuries after colonial rule has ended in the early 2000s. The preamble of the new constitution of Bolivia refers to it as a post-colonial and pluralistic state. This has to do with the way in which the constitution was created. By referring to the Andean mother goddess Pachamama, the Bolivian constitution attempts to effect a link with the past and with the indigenous people over there. This is also deepened with provisions that include a commitment to indigenous values, socio-economic rights, and the recognition of what are called plurinational rights. The Bolivian example is really significant because it serves to demonstrate that how structures that are created through colonialism often take years to remove even after the end of colonial rule and require immense political and economic changes. In terms of in the last part of this presentation, I will quickly focus on the example of Malawi, which is a situation where the liberal constitution has, through flawed interpretation and implementation, not worked as well as it should have. Now, Malawi, which was originally a British colony, saw a totalitarian regime emerge after independence in 1964, which only ended in the 1990s. The Malawian constitution of 1994 has been considered to be one of the world's most liberal constitutions, allowing for, among other things, human rights commissions, international law regimes, articulations of the right to development, livelihood, and fair labor practices. Its implementation, however, has been plagued with various problems. The lack of lawyers in Malawi has meant that only 250 lawyers attempt to interpret the constitution. It has not therefore been able to reach its transformative potential. Locus standi rules that could have been relaxed by broadly reading the sufficient interest clause of Article 15 of the Constitution have not been read in a purposive way, and therefore we can see how strict interpretation of legal doctrine has often been perceived as a barrier to justice delivery. This again ties up with Karl Clare's point that it is not only the text of the constitution that is significant if a constitution has to be truly transformative, but also the interpretation and the political structure of that country. Thank you.